So just briefly before I talk and get on to my next my opening segment here, I do want to take a minute to acknowledge what happened here on this past Friday. As I sit down to record this podcast, it's Sunday, September 1st, 2024, and this past Friday, Johnny Gaudreau, formerly of the Calgary Flames, and I guess now formerly of the Columbus Blue Jackets, he and his brother were struck by a drunk driver, and pretty much, as I understand it, killed on impact. He was a great hockey player, and at a time like this, it kind of seems, like such an utterly insufficient thing to say. I don't really have the right words, but I do just want to take a minute and just kind of say that right now, I think that at this particular juncture in time, I think this week we're all Calgary Flames fans. I think that this week we're all Columbus Blue Jackets fans. I do want to take a minute to wish the best, to Johnny's family. I know that a lot of people are going to miss Johnny hockey. And it's impossible, it's very difficult not to be one of them. He played for the opposition, but he was by all reports, he was a great teammate and a great person, and he was a great asset to the sport of hockey. He was a great, he was a great person within his family and within his community. And I know that pretty much all hockey fans out there they're fully in support of his friends and family at this time. I think we're all Flames fans this week. I think that we're all Blue Jackets fans. So that being said, I do want to continue with the next segment that I was going to talk about. And, I do have to take a minute and just kind of recognize also just how long it's been. I didn't even realize it had almost been like a month since the last time that I sat down to record this podcast. And that was really more than anything that was just procrastination. There was no reason for it. I mean, it's just like every time that there was a good opportunity to sit down and record another episode, I definitely had things on my mind to talk about, but I just kind of kept putting it off. And geez, pretty soon, wow. Like you think it's only been a week or two, and then suddenly you realize, oh, wow, almost a month. Like that's too long. It's too long. I almost, I definitely, I don't want to go that far, that long again. I would almost go so far as to say that like procrastination is almost like a superpower. It's like my superpower, and with great power comes great responsibility. And I almost kind of feel like maybe in this case it would be better to say that it would be more responsible not to use that power. And I'm gonna work really hard at being better about that, at not doing that. But a lot has happened since the last time that I sat down and actually recorded one of these podcasts. And actually, there was a whole podcast I had sat down and recorded and talked about how excited I was for the things that were going on with the Edmonton Oilers in this offseason, especially with what Jeff Jackson did when free agency opened. And it was so exciting because it really looked like we were going to have like an ultra competitive training camp. We had like 9 players that looked like they were ready to go out and compete for a spot in the top 6. Including, the very real possibility that some of these players that Jeff Jackson signed, were actually probably maybe going to have to settle for a role on the third line. I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case now that, certain recent events have transpired. And so, of course, there's only one thing that I could possibly be talking about, and that is the St. Louis Blues and their bullshit decision to offer sheet Philip Broberg and Dylan Holloway. Really changes the calculus at the both at forward and at defense. And there's a lot to say about that. I'm going to try and get to it all here, like one point at a time. But the first thing that I have to say is that it was such, like the Holloway offer sheet in particular was not so egregious. Nothing was offered to Dylan Holloway that was not super outrageous. The reason why the Oilers might have been in a position where they thought they was better to not match it, was entirely their own doing. But I'm going to get to that in a minute. But in particular, offering Philip Broberg $4.5 million per year to a player, while yes, he's very talented, very promising, and I think that he had finally started to come into his own, but a guy who had he had 81 games played in his entire NHL career. He was a plus minus, -5, if I remember correctly. Right? What was it? 13 total points in the NHL at that particular juncture of his career. And these guys are scooping him and they're offering him $4.5 million. Not only is that egregious, but it's incredibly irresponsible. So Doug Armstrong at the St. Louis Blues, what he just basically did is that now, when players go to, in particular, when a lot of RFAs, when they go to arbitration, now suddenly this Philip Broberg contract is something that they can roll out on the table and say that, if they gave Philip Broberg this much, then I, with what at that point are likely to be much greater, statistical accomplishments in the NHL up to that juncture, worth at least that and probably this much more. And arbitrators are likely to look at that and say, well, yeah, this particular contract, this offer sheet, it does set the value of what a defenseman with those statistical accomplishments are in the NHL, as low as the bar has just been set. There are arbitrators that work associated with this league that will be apt to take a look at that and say, yeah, this is the contract that should be offered, out of as the result of this arbitration process. And now it's going to put a lot of teams in these take it or leave it type of position. Doug Armstrong has completely screwed up the economics of the National Hockey League with this offer sheet. And every team in the league should be lined up looking for ways to screw over the St. Louis Blues for the foreseeable future. It should basically be scorched earth on this franchise. Not so much because they just came in and they plucked a really promising young player out of Edmonton. I'm going to address that a little bit more with my next point, but just because they have screwed up the salary economics of the league. Based on everything that could have been put on the table during that contract negotiation process, this Philip Broberg contract, I would say on paper, it's a worse contract than Bobby Holik. The contract that the Rangers gave to Bobby Holik, maybe as much to screw over the New Jersey Devils as anything else. But that deal, all the way back in, what was that? The early 2000s? Whatever year that was? 5 years, $40 million for Bobby Holik. Whatever. This contract is actually worse than that. Now, Philip Broberg might come out and he might live up to that contract. He might not live up to that contract. It might turn out to be a complete flop. Honestly, I do kind of feel like that's what Doug Armstrong and the Blues, that's what they deserve for having done this in the way that they did it. But, time is only going to tell on that one. But like I said, I was going to kind of talk a little bit more about Philip Broberg. I met Philip Broberg, I guess it was about 2 years ago now. Yeah, it was 2 years ago. I met him at an event And he was there meeting people and signing autographs and things. And I said to him, "Hey, you're going to go kill it in training camp." And he just kind of looked down and he shrugged, and I could tell like he was not confident on what was going to happen for him in training camp. And then he didn't go kill it in training camp. Like his training camp was very blasé, and he didn't make the team. And so it seems like he was a kind of player that had trouble with his confidence. But at the same time, I almost kind of feel like he wasn't really being given much help with his confidence. Because in the few instances where he actually did make it up to the NHL on a call-up, there was not a lot of forgiveness in that organization for Philip Broberg. His margin of error was very, very thin. Like there wasn't much that he could do and not get sent back to the minors again. And so I don't think that at all helped the situation where Philip Broberg, he went back and he worked on his game and he worked on his game and he worked on his game. And then finally it got to the point where he was so frustrated that he said, "Okay, listen, play me or trade me." It wasn't really so much, a trade demand as it was like a demand, to at least be brought up to Edmonton, to at least be around, the NHL club, or basically to be sent someplace where he was going to be given, a better chance than what he was given. And so that was kind of maybe one of the things that, as much as anything, kind of made me realize that, you know what, I mean, maybe the Oilers just don't deserve Philip Broberg. For the way that they handled him, they handled him since he became a prospect. Maybe the Edmonton Oilers just don't deserve Philip Broberg. And I think that also kind of shines through, in the sheer lack of urgency that was present in the contract negotiations. This is a bitter lesson for Jeff Jackson in terms of being the president of hockey operations. During that time when he was basically the acting general manager, and the first thing that he did was he came out and he spent the team's remaining cap space on a bunch of free agents. Some of whom might pan out, and some of whom may not. I mean, Arvidsson, he might come out and get hurt right away and spend God knows how long on the injured reserve. He tends to be, I've heard people refer to him as a glass cannon. He's injury prone. It's the best way to say it. Jeff Skinner has been a pretty reliable scorer, in the NHL regular season, but he has not played. He's played 0 playoff games. When the Oilers make the playoffs this year, he's a player that most likely the Edmonton Oilers are going to have to shelter for a game or two so that he can kind of experience NHL playoff hockey, because, it's a great league, obviously, best league in the world, but regular season hockey is no comparison to the playoffs. The pace is faster, it's more intense, there's a lot more urgency in playoff hockey, and Jeff Skinner is going to need to learn that. There are some players who tend to be very good regular season players, Austin Matthews, excuse me, who seem to take a very long time to learn that about the playoffs, like, if at all. It's not impossible that maybe Jeff Skinner could be one of those players that doesn't learn that about the playoffs. I mean, we're kind of just basically, that's a very, he's very, very untested, very unproven in terms of that. And so instead of coming out and taking care of business with the RFAs first, Jeff Jackson goes on this little spending spree. And as a result of that, he finds himself in a position where he has to scramble just for it to even be feasible, for it to even be an option for them to match these offer sheets that these two players got. And at the end, they did actually manage to open up the cap space, but they said to themselves, you know what? We're just gonna let it go. So that's a pretty bitter lesson for Jeff Jackson to have to learn. Awful way to have to learn it. It puts us in a really bad position with some of the things that are going to come up. Because, I mean, at the end of this upcoming season, Leon Draisaitl is up to be re-signed. And then Connor McDavid is going to be up for the year after. They're trying to negotiate with Leon Draisaitl right now, obviously. But what they have basically done is by letting Dylan Holloway walk, they've just kind of put themselves in a position here where now, everything that they have built for the last few years is basically that ultimately the bill is going to come due, in the sense that they're going to have players that are going to be in line for some pretty big raises. I mean, Zach Hyman is going to be in line for a huge raise. Draisaitl is in line for a huge raise. Like, they're going to have to let some of these players walk in free agency. And they don't have the talent anymore to replace them out of the prospect pool. And so basically, what they're going to, once they dole out the contracts that they're going to have to do, to hold on to Leon Draisaitl, to hold on to Connor McDavid, to hold on to Evan Bouchard. There's not going to be a whole lot of money to go out and spend in the market to bring in the kind of players that they're going to need. They're basically telling these guys that you're going to have to sit through a rebuild. And not only are they going to have to sit through a rebuild, but they're going to have to sit through a rebuild that's going to begin as they themselves ultimately go into a period of decline themselves. I mean, they want to re-sign, apparently from the sounds of it, Leon Draisaitl. He wants an 8-year contract. He will start to go into decline during the duration of that contract. And he will be a pretty expensive player to be going through decline while on a contract of that duration. As much as we're enjoying what we're seeing right now, it is going to be paid for in the form of the rebuild that this team will have to undergo again. And that's what they're asking these players to sit through. After they already had to sit through, that little rebuild, following the, God, what year was that? I have a terrible memory right now. I'm distracted by motorboats. It's very cool. People are racing their river boats up and down the Wapiti River here. But the playoff run 2018 terminated against the beat San Jose and then lost to Anaheim. And then they had a few missteps in the offseason and kicked themselves back into a rebuild. And these players have already, McDavid and Draisaitl have both already stayed through that rebuild. And now they've pretty much guaranteed that there's going to be another rebuild. God knows how long that one will actually take. Hopefully it won't be another decade of darkness, but that's the situation that has been created now. Now that they're not going to have Dylan Holloway, to be the guy to step up and help them carry the franchise forward. That is a bitter lesson. It's a terrible way to learn it. But it is the situation that we're in, as a franchise. So whatever happens this upcoming season, over this season, or maybe the couple after, depending on what gets done in terms of those two contracts, I kind of feel like what's coming up here this next year, we'd better take care to really make sure that we enjoy it. And if we are so lucky that they're able to extend, this era, I think we'd better enjoy the next couple after that. Because, the bill for that is going to come due. It always does, especially in any league any sports league that has a salary cap. There's only so good you can be for so long, before just the economics, that ceiling that they put over your head in terms of how much money you can spend to keep it together, before all of that pretty much takes it apart. And I think that at this juncture, when that arrives, I think we're going to have to look at what happened in this offseason with those two offer sheets as the prime driving factors of how and why it happened.